This is a Stimulus Network podcast. Hello and welcome to Inside the Petri Dish, the podcast that puts science under a microscope. I'm Alice Gray.
I'm Vicki Blight.
I'm Tay and Alice.
And we're joining you live from Cardiff Science Festival in front of a live audience.
Hello, live audience.
Great enthusiasm for this miserable topic, because what are we looking at today?
Basically, we want to save the planet. We want to save the world. But how do we do that? So many different things we could be talking about: climate change, plastics. I'm sure we're going to mention a lot of things: veganism, meat, all of that kind of stuff. So the floor's open, really. And I'm sure if someone shouts something during the podcast today, one of our lovely audience members, then we're happy to chat about it, aren't we? I think so.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
So we've got guests joining us from a range of different topics to help us put our plan together. Because, it's a little bit ambitious because,
we're only three women at the end of the day. And
we've set ourselves a big challenge, haven't we?
Yeah.
To save the world. I feel like a Marvel character. I feel like I should have got kind of dressed up in some kind of lycra. Well, it's probably too early to start talking about that. But first off, though, Alice, tell us a bit more about the Cardiff Science Festival, because I've literally just kind of come into it today, but you've been really busy with it.
Yeah, so the Cardiff Science Festival has run since Thursday, all over half term. The idea is that we want to show everyday science in everyday places, presenting something new by someone new, somewhere new. So because science affects our everyday life, we should be able to bump into it in everyday places. So we've got pop-up events all over the city centre, from pubs, not quite clubs, but also cafes. Next year. Clubbing, science of clubbing.
A science silent disco. That's all I'm saying.
Can we have dangly neurons and brains from the ceiling? And
maybe. I feel like that might be a little bit a
bit meta.
Yeah. But yeah, so there's loads of stuff going on, something for everyone, something for kids, families and adults. Get your mind out the gutter. Adult science.
Even said anything apart from mentioning a little bit about superheroes and lycra, but I'm on squeaky clean duty because I don't want to embarrass anyone in the audience. Yeah. We won't be talking about sex bots today.
Yeah,
that's in a previous episode. Feel free to download, subscribe, rate and review. That's how other people will find Inside the Petri Dish a lot easier.
Yeah. So bringing it back round to our mission today, yes. The world is ending? Question mark.
There's a lot of doom and gloom on news and lots of other media channels nowadays, isn't there? It's quite hard to scroll through BBC News or Instagram even without feeling like, oh God, the world is ending. There's no point to do anything anymore. But I think a really nice thing of that as well is there's a lot more people rising up on social media and doing what they can in little ways to help.
And kids taking to the street and skipping school because yesterday, so the day before this was recorded, government met for the first time in 2 years to talk about climate change and barely anyone turned up.
I think there was 50 MPs altogether.
It's just bizarre. It's the biggest problem of our time, the most impending doom that we are facing, and no one's talking about it other than school children.
Yeah, I was at work when one of the school strikes happened in Bristol, and all we could hear all of a sudden was hundreds of tiny little voices screaming about climate protests, which is amazing. Looked out of the window and all of these school children were marching up the road, triumphantly bearing their banners and all of their placards, and they looked amazing. People were driving past giving them high fives in their cars. It was epic.
It comes to something when skipping school is going to save the world, isn't it, really?
I think for me, though, we're so distracted at the moment. And I think because of what's happening internationally in various parts of the world, but if we're going with social media, as much as you see stuff which is really positive, you're constantly bombarded by Trump this, Trump that, or Brexit this, Brexit that, and everyone is distracted. And instead of looking at the important things, people are arguing over, who said what and who wrote what and who did a deal with who and all this kind of stuff. So for me, another aspect within it, we've got to talk about visibility today, but I think how confused are the messages becoming because of other things that are happening in politics and around the world, which maybe are dominating and burying some real issues that we actually need to deal with in a time-sensitive way.
Because ultimately, a deal for Brexit is really important. But the world ending is probably a little bit more should be higher on the radar.
And I feel... I think we spoke about this before, but I feel really protective now. You know, I have a little son and he's 9 months old, and something has changed now that I've become a mum, and you just are so conscious about the world and what he's going to grow up into. And I want to, you know, fill him with positivity and have an open mind and be whatever you want to be, but be what you can see and or be that person and follow your own path. But I really want to empower him, and my worry is that with all of the infighting and the bickering and just the kind of tiredness of certain aspects of world news, that he's just going to grow up in a really cynical, suppressed, slightly kind of defeatist world, and I don't want that to happen.
No.
Do you think people find that quite overwhelming, and maybe they want to get more involved, but they just see all of the politics and everything else going on with their lives? You know, everyone has their own problems. And maybe people do want to get more involved in saving the world in their own little way, but they're so overwhelmed by everything else going on. I think it can be quite, you know, you can feel quite hopeless in a sense.
Yeah, I know that certainly from the Brexit conversations, I have to take mental breaks from it and segment my news. So something like emissions and CO2 and the urgent need to address these problems might be something you might want to tune out of, because that is just terrifying, and we're all just marching towards doom, watching comedy shows and reality TV, trying to just distract ourselves,
sending gifts to each other. That,
yeah,
you know,
funny
someone going, or you know, just because there is nothing left to smile about, rather than someone sticking their finger in their mouth and making a pop noise.
Yeah, like it's true. Like a funny gif will just distract you for 1 minute.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've set ourselves a big task here into creating a plan, and this is why we're getting the experts in, because, as you said, we're just three passionate women.
I hope so.
Yeah, but
For sure.
Yeah.
we need to put a plan together, and we're not necessarily experts in this area. So we've got some interesting conversations that we added later, as well as us talking about stuff ourselves. So we might as well bring on our first guest.
Our first guest is Dr. Jon Runyan from the Gas Turbine Research Centre. He's here to discuss fuels of the future. He's just taking his seat now, walking across the very large room, massive
Filled
audience
with people.
Oh, they're literally giving him high fives.
Yeah. He's running back and forth. He's crowd surfing. Guys, he's crowd surfing.
He's a rock star.
We're being filmed. We can't get away with that.
I know. I'm sorry, but you know.
Also, for the people who are listening to the podcast and not in the live audience, Jon is wearing an Inside the Petri Dish badge, which I am very happy about. Thank you so much.
Cool, aren't they?
Well, thank you. It's the whole reason I came.
Ripping our merch.
Now, Dr. Jon, if I may call you that.
Go for it.
Dr. Jon, tell us a little bit first about who you are, what you do, where you're based. Just introduce our audience to you if they don't know your work, and our wider audience as well.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a research associate at Cardiff University. So I'm based in the Gas Turbine Research Center, which is in the School of Engineering at the university. It's an off-site facility, large-scale combustion experiments. That's really my MO. That's what I'm into.
So when you're a kid at school and you say, I want to do science because explosions, that is literally your job.
Yes.
You are winning at life.
End of interview. I don't think we can talk about that.
Explosions might not be the thing we want to talk about
No,
when it's the
probably
end
not.
of the world, though, is it?
No, let's go away from that.
But hey, if we need to prepare, then he's the guy.
Yeah.
For sure. So you work across a few areas, and we'll get into that as we go through. But one of them is kind of looking into carbon-free fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia. We wanted to chat today, you know, Alice and Tay, we wanted to chat about the fact that are our fuel options for the future? What are realistic fuel options for the future?
Sure. I think we kind of take two approaches. So if we think about the use of energy in our homes, a lot of people have a natural gas pipeline that's coming into their homes. It's feeding their boilers. It might be feeding their hobs for cooking. There are projects in place in the UK to try to replace that natural gas with hydrogen. So removing the carbon from your fuel source, we're decarbonizing our fuel coming into our homes. So there are projects that are ongoing with that. Up in Leeds, there's H21 project, which is looking at taking all the natural gas out of the grid and replacing that with hydrogen. And then in Liverpool, there's another project called HyNet, which is looking at blending hydrogen into the natural gas grid as a kind of partial decarbonization. So that's kind of where we are at with our homes. In terms of the way that we move around in the UK, so our transport, I think there's a big push towards electrification. So trying to get away from petrol and diesel to electrified cars, hybrid electric vehicles. So I think that's kind of that's probably the future ambition I would say as far as transport is concerned.
That's really interesting, because one of the sort of recommended things for if we want to save the planet in the future is to by 2030 having 75 to 85% of our fuels as renewable fuels.
But I think one theme which is going to run through this podcast today, I'm going to put the prediction down now, is money. Let's talk about the cost of these things. Obviously, these projects are underway, but are the big companies, are their eyes lighting up thinking, okay, this is going to be amazing, this is going to save us money, or are they going to have to outlay actually quite a bit of money to make these things happen?
I think cost is an interesting topic when we talk about moving forward with energy in the UK, and not just from the companies, but also what the cost is to the consumer. And so the push to decarbonize, I think you see it in the media about rising energy costs for people in their homes, fuel poverty, things like that. That's all things that you have to take into account. And there's a price. There's a price associated with the generation of hydrogen. So if you're going to generate hydrogen using electrolysis, then you need to purchase electricity to make that process work. If you're going to generate electricity through steam methane reforming, you have to purchase natural gas to make that work. And so there's an economic choice that has to be made, or perhaps a change that has to occur. That if you're going to move away from fossil fuels for hydrogen production, then the cost of electricity has to come down so that you then are incentivized to use electricity in the electrolysis process instead. Until that happens, I think it would be difficult to see companies really starting to invest in some of those technologies, because they can say, well, the natural gas is cheap. And if the push is for me to make hydrogen and make it economically, then I'm going to purchase natural gas to make that with.
And I guess with, vehicles as well and transport, in terms of electric cars, it's still seen as quite a luxury to be able to afford a pretty smart, very good hybrid vehicle, or, an electric vehicle. Most people aren't interested. They think that that's kind of out of their price range. Only the rich people are driving around in the brand new, insert car make, but the big ones, your Audis, your Lexuses, they seem to be coming out with this kind of mind-blowing technology. And you think, wow, an electric car, and it's got this and it's got that, or a hybrid and it's got this and it's got that, and it's better than those because it's can do. But at the same time, is it affordable? Is it an option for families? Is it an option for people who are kind of going, right, well, my bills are going up, my fuel's going up, and everyone's talking about the planet. I should be swapping my vehicle to something healthier, but with what? With what spare cash am I going to do that? So again, cost. I guess we can talk about the financial cost. We can talk about the cost for future generations as well, and where who steps in and maybe subsidizes, who steps in and goes, we're going to have to put money into this because actually this is going to make the leap forward and that's going to push on the next generation.
And I think one of the interesting things that people perhaps don't talk about in terms of moving away from petrol and diesel to electric vehicles is that the government stands to lose out on a lot of tax revenue from that. The government generates a lot of tax revenue from selling us fossil fuels at the petrol station. And so if we're moving away from that, and then all of a sudden politicians are saying, well, I'm losing an income stream from that, are people going to be happy to see an extra tax put on the electricity that's coming out of the wall to charge their electric vehicle? Are they going to be happy to do that? I don't know the answer to that. But I think perhaps people have, because petrol and diesel has been around for so long, people are probably normalized to the tax paying that they're doing every time they go to the petrol station. And so it may take a bit of public awareness and public education to kind of, for people to wrap their heads around the fact that you may end up having to pay extra for the electricity because the politicians don't want to lose out on a potentially lucrative income stream that they've had for decades.
Well, a lot of people I speak to about, diesel vehicles, and you think about the conversations you have and they go, oh, it's okay because I've got a brand new diesel and it's one of these, kind of Euro 6 rated emissions, blah, 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 blah. And they start quoting all this stuff, which was obviously in the gumph when they bought the car. Is there something to say that these cleaner diesel engines actually are more environmentally friendly and they are an option for people that are trying to think in that mindset? Or should they just step away from petrol and diesel completely and commit to electric?
Well, the UK to some extent has made that decision. So there are policies that are being put in place at the moment to try to move car sales away from petrol and diesel only engines. So by 2040, there shouldn't be a pure diesel or petrol engine vehicle on the market anymore. And so the government is driving that kind of consumer choice almost, because perhaps to some extent that's the way that it should be if there is a greater good in that. Electric vehicles for local air quality and for use inside of cities and things like that, I think that there's a case to be made for moving away from diesel in terms of inner city use. But the question for me always becomes, are you just shifting those emissions somewhere else? So if you're still generating electricity for your electric car using a fossil fuel power source, but hey, it's outside the city, it doesn't affect local air quality, we can move our emissions from the end of the tailpipe to the end of a stack somewhere outside of the city. It may answer one question, one problem, but not quite address what is a broader issue of perhaps global warming type emissions.
That's a really interesting point you raised, because for a lot of rural communities, the only way that they can get around, get to school, get to work is by owning a car. And I think a lot of the people living in those areas would face a lot more social isolation if they didn't have those options available to them. And I think there's so much infrastructure that needs to be put in place for people to, get to the point where they don't have to own a car anymore. And I think there's, it's not just the money issue, but it's things like, how am I going to get my kids to school? How am I going to see anyone if I live out in the countryside where there's no buses, there's no train routes? And, there are so many issues around, especially elderly generations who live in rural areas of the UK. So you mentioned quite a good point about just the isolation and, shifting the blame, I guess, to rural areas.
I think that's especially interesting if you're looking at, say, carbon offset and things, which we'll be talking about in a minute, where, you can make all of these efforts, but if you're moving it to somewhere else, it's not actually solving the problem. And if it also continue with deforestation and things like that, it's just shifting our focus rather than really drilling down.
I did have a question just before we go slightly off topic, but how do we in the UK and what we're doing in terms of research into renewable fuels and our facilities here, and how the universities are on board with it, and grants and research. How are we stacking up against the rest of the world? Because this is the other thing, is the UK is very, 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 very small compared to countries like China and America,
Even
Russia.
though we don't think it.
So how are we stacking up in terms of what we're doing in science in this area compared to the rest of the world?
Well, I think that there's a lot of quality for perhaps the size of the country. I think the UK punches above its weight in terms of academic quality. Still some of the most leading universities in the world. There is investment in the area, so I'm currently funded off of a project called the Flexus Project, which shout out to the EU, is an EU-funded
Funny that
EU-funded. So it's funded through the Welsh European Funding Office through Cardiff University, and it's a pan Wales consortium of universities that are looking at energy systems, and the focus on Port Talbot as an energy system, and trying to integrate how can we. If the steelworks is generating excess heat, can we use that excess heat in a local hospital? Trying to integrate and look at energy systems from a whole systems approach. And then you can take that knowledge and you can apply that to energy clusters around the world. So you could look at an industrial facility or industrial cluster in China or in India or in other developing countries. And you can say, well, we've developed a plan for integrating energy systems together in Wales, and now we can export that knowledge to developing countries. So I think there's investment, whether it's coming from the UK government or from the EU, and that investment is hopefully going to drive some change, outside of the UK borders.
But
sorry, I was just going to say that for me is exciting, like that. That way of, like we were saying, you can take from one place and then you're losing it from somewhere else, and it's all about keeping a balance. But if you can kind of create some kind of bubble where you are keeping an equilibrium within that area, and you're pushing fuel that way, excess here, excess there, maybe that's the mindset we need to be in.
But for the UK itself, hydrogen and electrification, how achievable is that within? I don't know what the time frame is. Is it 20 years? Is it 40 years? How far away is that goal of being completely switching to alternative fuels away from petrol?
Well, the timelines are longer than the political life cycle, which is what really makes it difficult, because you have politicians that come in and out, and they have their agenda for perhaps a short period of time. This is a longer term issue. Me personally, I think it is achievable. I think you have to have certain things in place. I think you have to have a sound government policy that is hopefully ambitious, but hopefully funded, for that level of the correct level of ambition. I think you also have to have a certain amount of public buy-in, and the public has to be well informed. I think it's easy to be misled on certain energy issues.
Brexit.
Dirty words. Stop mentioning that. Edit it out all the time.
And if I can just fly the flag, I think we need to have more engineers as well. So increasing the engineering workforce and encouraging people to study and solve these problems is another key point.
So I think one of the main points you brought up is money. So that'll be in our plans. If we can have a quick whip round, we'll be able to get that together, right?
If you could pay for your badges.
Yeah, we'll have the money in no time. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Jon.
Sure.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
That wasn't painful, was it?
No.
So after that, I think one of the things we brought up during that conversation was CO2 emissions are one of the biggest problems that we're facing. Part of many problems that are contributing to the end of the world. How many times are we going to say, let's make a drinking game out of this, because the amount of times I'm going to say end of the world.
Need something stronger, to be honest.
Is CO2. And so CO2 offset is also really important, because the one of the government guidelines in the scientific recommendations for how we're going to, stop the world from ending is to have net zero emissions by 2050, which not only means transferring how we're using our fuels and what fuels we're using, but also increasing stuff like planting trees and stopping cutting them down and stuff.
I have an interesting little nugget on the whole planting trees. So I mentioned my son, and he was born 9 months ago, but a couple of months ago, an exciting letter came through the post. No idea. It's like, well, it's not a bill. It's not it's nothing. It's not a birthday card. What is it? So I opened it up, and it was like a little certificate to say that the Welsh government had planted a tree for Rowan, and they plant a tree for every child born in Wales. So that gives you the location, and that's his tree.
That is incredibly
That was
sweet.
really cool. Who knew? I didn't know about that. So another thing I think we will discuss. So money is one, education is another, because if we're not aware of these things, if we're not aware of all of these different initiatives that are being set up, then no one's going to get excited about it or spread the word or do more of that, or it won't encourage other people in other areas to go, oh, we should do that. That's working well in Wales. We should do that across the whole of the UK, or whatever it might be. So I think education and actually getting the information out there is going to be something.
And I think one of the interesting things to talk about when we talk about education, and I'm not saying this as a vegan, but switching away from meat consumption is going to be, it's moving away from dairy and meat is one of the biggest things that you can do to stop to lessen your impact on the environment. And as a British sort of Western culture, we love our meat. We'll eat several kinds of meat in one meal, in one day. And actually talking about why veganism and vegetarianism is sort of increasing exponentially, and why it's good for the planet is something I think we really need to talk more about.
I mean, movements like Veganuary, if that's how you say it.
Yeah.
I thought that was something else. Okay, yeah, I'm with you.
Did you swap the A and the E?
No, nothing. Don't mind me. No.
We'll go into that.
That's another month.
That's another time. But little movements like that are great. And, you know, like you say, sharing these kinds of initiatives with other people, but not just on a bigger scale, but with your friends too. And just talking about people in your friendship circle that, you know, if you're changing the way you eat, if you are a meat lover, it doesn't mean you have to give it up entirely. No one's telling you to become vegan. Just swap it out maybe once every couple of days, try something new. And, you know, every little helps. Everyone can do something.
You had a vegan sausage roll today?
Yeah, I had my first Greg's vegan sausage roll. If you haven't tried one, I highly recommend it. They were so good.
There's a potential sponsor for the podcast.
Yeah, so say we are not sponsored by Greg.
We are not sponsored by Greg.
Maybe corn.
If you want to.
Mention as many.
Yeah.
I actually haven't eaten any meat today. Yet today. Actually, no, I won't be eating meat today because I know what I'm having for tea. So no, it's a meat-free day for me today. I do eat meat, but my partner and I are conscious of the amount of meat that we eat in a week, and we've definitely cut down in the last couple of years, especially. It's and we're also mindful about where, you know, it's where we source our meat from as well. But again, is that another thing? You go into a supermarket and you see aisles and aisles and aisles of all of this meat on offer, 3 for $10, blah, blah, blah. And we're back to that whole thing. Is it an affordable option for people to actually stop eating meat, buy more lentils and pulses and beans and vegetables and tofu and all of this other thing? Because when I walk into the supermarket, I'm not being funny, you go to a free from area or one of the areas for the supermarket that is promoting kind of veganism and it's like triple the price.
But I think that's also because from a society where we've always had meat to veg, that's just ingrained in that's how
Sorry,
that
I'm such a child.
I didn't even think of that.
Sorry.
Oh, you've lost your trail of thought, so I'm sorry. Because as British people, we love our meat and 2 veg, Vicky. We just love it. We cannot get enough of meat and 2 veg.
I would argue.
Yeah. But the freeform option is just replacing that with something else rather than actually something like lentils is 35p, and actually rather than having that idea of what our meals look like in that structure. It's just like it's something ingrained that's in us. That's not how meals normally look like for other people.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, I don't know about you guys, but when I was younger, I don't remember ever seeing a, free from section in the supermarket. And nowadays, every supermarket has one. So it's definitely on the rise. And, as consumers' choices towards those options increase and they're more in demand, they will get cheaper. But, things like you said, I think I absolutely love Jack Monroe. I don't know if you guys know who she is. She's the author of a book called The Bookstrap Cook, and she has so many amazing vegan and vegetarian recipes. And I think we were talking about education and just empowering yourself. And I think cooking is such an empowering thing to do, especially if you're making a dietary change, because you can try out so many different things. And if you just have a bit of experimentation, there are so many ways you can make cheap, nourishing food for yourself that is meat-free. And so, I just recommend you to just go on a website or ask your mates and just try out new recipes.
And talking about Veganuary, I think this year, so in 2019, 250,000 people took part in Veganuary, which is amazing. Whether they did it the whole month totally vegan or partly, it just shows how it's on the rise. People are becoming more interested in it, and because of that, more restaurants have started putting vegan options in. I can go so many places now and have food. It's so exciting.
It's really cool, actually. It's really cool how, even places in not big cities, there's this really cool place, I'm not going to mention it, but in Monmouth.
That sounded so hip, so you won't know it, don't worry.
You won't know it, don't worry. I want to keep it secret because it's really cool. But I won't mention the place, but I went there for the first time a few months back, and literally they bring out the menu, and they don't just give you the menu and then there's like a vegetarian section or a couple of vegan options.
Which is just lasagna normally.
Yeah. So literally there was the main menu, then there was a vegetarian menu exactly the same size as the main menu, so the second main menu, and then there was a separate vegan menu as well, which had shitloads of options on it. So I think definitely people are embracing it now, and people are realizing, like you say, it's not that difficult to make a few substitutions and swap a few things and use something instead of something else and make some really tasty food.
So from maybe a bit of a bio about me is like, so my dad actually my entire life has made cheese. That has been his job.
So
not from scratch. He works in a factory that makes cheese. And then my grandparents were all dairy farmers. So and cattle farmers. So it's not like it's not something, so I don't have anything against these people or those movements. I think actually movements to more sustainable, smaller farms, empower smaller farmers is really important, because what's happening now is the meat industry is thriving so much that actually small farms can't actually cope with the demand. So we're growing to these big industrial scales, which are multi-million pound organisations, often faceless, who don't interact with their animals, so the practices are questionable. Whereas actually, people think that taking people away from eating meat, it will have an impact on smaller Welsh farmers, for example, when actually taking the power away from people who can run these multi-million pound businesses and actually empowering people who can make smaller, more sustainable, better for the environment farms than these big, giant industrial sort of operations that are all in sheds and things. It's way better for the environment. People can still eat their meat, and it's actually better for industry, especially smaller businesses. And so even though my family is made of dairy farmers and cattle farmers and people who make dairy, there's 2 vegans in my family. Me and my sister are vegans, and I saw my brother a couple of months ago, and he sort of looked at me like he had something serious to tell me, and he turns to me, he's like, "So I've decided to not eat meat during the week. It's not for the animals, it's for the environment."
Preserve his manlyhood while he says that.
Yeah, he's just like, "It's not for the animals. I don't care about them. It's for the environment."
Okay.
He just had to say, I don't care about the animals. It's just for me and my money and the environment. And now he just eats meat on the weekends, or if he goes out, and that's a great option to have. When I ate meat, I really liked it. But I wanted to make a change that would actually have a big difference, because you make such an impact by moving away from meat.
And I think people forget that it's not just the animals themselves that are contributing to carbon emission, but you also have all of the pasture that is used to grow their food, and all of the, areas of land that are that are made into pasture to feed these animals and look after them and have them in areas to graze on, and that contributes to biodiversity loss in the UK. If you're in a plane flying over the UK, all you see is fields and fields and fields, but it's actually a biodiverse desert. There's not much room for many animals to thrive there, and all of that is something that isn't really talked about as much. I guess people forget that when they think about meat and their carbon emissions.
And when we're talking about destruction of habitats, it's interesting from a sort of cultivating crops perspective about conserving the biodiversity and the ecosystems in those areas, because I don't know whether you saw in the news recently, but there's been a huge decline in insects populations in the UK, and other animals and ecosystems, and how big of an impact that is having on food crops. So moving away from deforestation and looking at ecosystems in a more sort of wholesome, I hate the word holistic, but I'll say holistic way is...
Why do you hate the word holistic?
It just makes me think of alternative medicine.
Okay, don't. That's a whole other podcast as well. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's interesting that, because for example, talking about deforestation for food, like meat, the amount of space needed to grow vegetables and plant-based food is so much smaller than the amount needed for animals, because you then also have to grow their food as well. And also, if we want to talk about CO2 offset, growing plants is probably much better for the environment that we're going to eat and then replicate. Is probably much better for the environment than mass production of meat, which is producing methane and other harmful elements. What word am I thinking of? Other harmful
Where's
gases.
your twin when we need her? She would know. You're psychically linked. Right?
So yeah, that kind of nicely leads us on
to our second guest. Yeah. So we have someone in the audience today, someone joining us, who can tell us all about this kind of really important link between different species who are kind of at the bedrock of other animals in the food chain and how that all links together. So we have someone joining us. Victoria Stanley Choi is a environmentalist, digital nomad, conservationist. There's so many ways I could describe
we were having
you.
a conversation about this on the train, about there wasn't really one word to describe kind of what I was interested in.
Conservation digital genius. That is not your new job
I'll
title.
roll with that. I like it. Hello.
Hi,
Thank you for
let's
joining us.
welcome Victoria.
Thank you.
I suppose.
So, sorry.
Carry on.
I wanted to ask you about. Alice briefly mentioned the decline of insects, and we were looking into that. We were chatting about that a little bit before the podcast started, and I guess if insects disappeared tomorrow, all insects on the whole of the planet disappeared, and we didn't have any left, what would actually happen?
Gosh, where do we begin? So losing insects, wow, that's probably one of the biggest issues that we're facing at the moment. I don't know if you've been following the news recently. There was a study published talking about how many insects we've lost in the last 25 years. And it's, phenomenally big. And what you're looking at essentially is you're losing a lot of pollinators. And pollinators are essential for sort of crop generation. Our food sources are going to be compromised. We're also looking at the food chain being completely disrupted. You're looking at sort of larger apex predators as well. At the very top are going to be influenced by a loss of biodiversity and mass, with the food chain being compromised as a result. It just kind of, it all works together, doesn't it? And also the recycling of nutrients is going to be completely destroyed.
Would we have just dead trees lying around anywhere without being broken down?
I think, to be honest, it depends on the environment, the biome in particular. I mean, most of the biodiversity and biomass of these insects is probably taking place in tropical forests, big biodiversity hotspots. We're looking at places like the Amazon as one of them, as the biggest, one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. And you would essentially just see the collapse of these environments completely, and that's incredibly scary. And the knock-on effects of that, we can talk about things like our food chains. We can talk about the food that we end up, harvesting and not being able to have that level of sort of crop growing. But when we also think about the impact that it will have on the climate itself, all of these things are intrinsically interlinked, and it's really terrifying kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, I just noticed that while you were talking, I just whispered, oh God.
Yeah.
Because I suppose one of the reasons we kind of wanted to get you on here is because you're also a filmmaker as well.
Yes.
And I suppose something like Blue Planet and programs about these problems are really important for...
Incredibly, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about why that's important?
Yeah, so I think there's an element of things like the big blue chip documentaries, and I'm sure Tay can also say something about this as she works for the BBC. They have such a huge impact on people who don't necessarily have access to the scientific community and the scientific facts surrounding climate change and biodiversity loss. And you're also empowering people to make small changes in many respects. I mean, now I briefly spoke to Vicki about this. Things like Blue Planet really tackled the plastics problem. And, I'm all for the plastic-free movement. It's an incredibly important thing that we need to talk about. But as somebody who also works in science communication, I'm finding time and time again that the public are misconstruing plastic problems with climate change. And time again, I hear that people are assuming that climate change is caused by plastic. And that is quite concerning. So while I do believe that things like Blue Planet have done wonders for the plastic-free movement, I think there also needs to be less of a distraction from a more imminent issue, in my opinion, which is climate change. And what that means is essentially you do have people who are making, very significant changes in their plastic habits, but perhaps not in the changes that are needed to stop the onslaught of climate demise. Now, both are extremely important, and I do think that big blue chips have a role to play in inspiring people, because besides the plastic problem, when you do watch documentaries, you become very protective and very inspired about the natural world, and it does compel you to make a difference. And there's an element of perhaps maybe this is something that can be quite contentious in the scientific community, where people are sort of anthropomorphizing different animals, and to the public that makes them relatable and that makes them worth fighting for. And, I'm sure we have all kind of seen parts of Dynasties and the penguins. So Lindsay McRae was the filmmaker, and I worked with him on Springwatch. And I'd heard that during that time, his wife had given birth to his newborn son, and he'd been away for a year. And he went and saved those small little penguins. And I can imagine Lindsay being a new dad, being away from his child in Antarctica, and just seeing all of these vulnerable penguins and thinking, I can't just sit here and do nothing. And it's those sorts of connections that you have with the wild world that make you compelled to make a difference, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that's really, really important. And that's why these documentaries are extremely empowering and can make such a huge impact on people's behaviours.
And I think maybe what you mentioned about the anthropomorphizing of animals like polar bears and penguins is really interesting, because when we talk about the insect demise,
people don't feel like they can relate.
because they're not cute, cuddly animals. We
They're not
barely see
charismatic.
them. Yeah.
They're not charismatic.
No.
I don't know.
I've seen some pretty charismatic stick insects.
I mean, I absolutely love insects. I think they're great, full of character. And I don't know if any of you came across this this peacock spider montage, like this Merry Christmas thing. You've seen it. Yes. Someone is on the same page as me.
Okay, I'm gonna Google that.
It is incredible. It's essentially somebody who's put little Christmas hats on these dancing peacock spiders. It's just adorable. Everyone should go watch it. It's just like your daily dose of happiness.
But that's why, things like not just the big, glamorous, sexy blue chip documentaries like Planet Earth 2 are important, but also things like GIFs on the internet, as stupid as they sound.
Yeah.
Having a little GIF of a dancing spider.
Digital media is so important.
It's really
so
powerful.
important. And time again, we're being told that this is one of the most exciting times to be alive for digital media, because you are seeing so many young people spending time online and having access to a plethora of resources that have the potential to impact their behavior and therefore the future. And I think that's something that we need to capitalize on, that the conservation messages that are kind of being talked about in documentaries are incredibly important, but we should also focus on creating accessible, engaging media that can be accessed by all online. And if we think about the average attention span of yourself, how often do you spend being able to sit still for a whole hour and a half? I mean, I know I'm somebody self-proclaimed lover of documentaries, but I struggle. But when I see, a cute GIF of a spider with a Christmas hat on, I'm all over that. You have my attention 110%. So it's great.
And so, as a filmmaker, would you say you focus more on what's more important? Is it the production of the film itself and the kind of message that that you try to spread with that film? Or is it a package, more of a deal with the film as well as the kind of social and digital content that follows alongside it? What do you think people will see more and engage with more?
The latter, for me at least. I think they're definitely important parts of both, but it's the dissemination of the content, which I think is really important, because I think previously, so I work with my partner and we have a platform for making conservation films and creating SciComm for researchers. And
their platform is called Journal Ecology.
Yeah.
So kind of like journal ecology. Check it out on Twitter.
It's really funny because everyone thinks we're a journal and we have to kind of like break it to them. We're like, we're not there yet. So, when we're creating that content, we have so many different streams in mind. When we think about all of these social media platforms that we have available to us, we think, how are we going to tailor what we've created to make shorts that are accessible to people? So we made a film and a very, very early on project of ours with the Hong Kong Dolphin Conservation Society. And this actually came at a really good time when Blue Planet 2 had launched their digital campaign, Our Blue Planet. And so Mark Brownlow, who's the series producer of Blue Planet 2, collaborated with us and got one of our shots on a digital piece. And what that meant was actually that, the whole film itself followed the journey of kind of, I guess, what the researchers were doing. But the actual snippet that they took was some drone footage that we had of a pod of 9 or so Chinese white dolphins just swimming in plastic. And that was all people needed to see, really, to convey the message that it was an issue. And that was, really widely shared on social media. It wasn't longer than about 40 seconds. And I think that has far-reaching consequences and has way more impact than, our film would have otherwise. And I think that's really important to remember, that you can make something, but you can also tailor different pieces to different social media platforms in a way that is going to engage your audience in the best possible way. And so, I think it's really important to champion that as well.
How provocative do you think documentaries and projects need to be going forward to make an impact?
That's a really good question, because I feel like there are definitely two sides to the coin. And a lot of the time, you see articles in the news kind of perhaps criticising big documentary sort of filmmakers for not tackling the hard-hitting issues. And while I really care about these issues themselves, we have to remember that it's a journey for a lot of people. And I very much believe that, for instance, again, going back to Blue Planet 2, it took people on quite an emotional journey to the point where it really did empower people to make changes. And that was successful, extremely successful. And, there are people who want those hard-hitting documentaries, but I think we have to tailor to all audiences. I think those documentaries should still exist, and there should also be conversations happening around conservation and, climate demise as well. Whether that's the responsibility of, big production companies is quite a contentious issue, because at the end of the day, as Tay knows, commissioning is a very tricky thing. It is a business. It has a business model. It requires money. And that's why a lot of people are going freelance. And that's why you find a lot of people perhaps breaking away from traditional production values to creating their own freelance and indies, which produce very hard-hitting documentaries. And I think that's the thing. There's something for everyone. And if you want to stick to something which is perhaps a bit more palatable, if you don't necessarily have, environmental implications, or you don't really have any real sort of, scientific background in that, there's something that can guide you and can inspire you to make changes. But if you are also somebody who's quite invested in it, the hard-hitting documentaries might further your cause and make you more willing to make some changes. So I think both are very important.
And in terms, to all of you, because, you all work in science communication in some form, the way that, as you say, some things are made more palatable, more accessible, it's a job in itself to be the person that decides where the line is and what is provocative enough to create the response, as you mentioned, that drone shot of the dolphins. That said it all. But making that judgment, and that's all we need over shots of, any kind of animal feeding their young plastic, as we've seen those shots as well. I think as we go forward, surely there need to be people that are really interested in the actual messaging process. And Definitely. As you say, documentary makers, you've all done various parts of that, and that judgment and that picking the tone, setting the tone, and having the right response rather than going too far and possibly scaring people, because then if people become fearful, what do? They turn around and walk away and just go, don't want to. That's a massive job in itself.
It's so difficult, and as you say, because effectively, the first part of call is we are an entertainment company. Yeah. We are storytellers first and foremost. We're not out there to educate people. We're out there to entertain, and that has to undercut everything we do. And so it's so hard to kind of tell that story that is still going to appeal to people seeing beautiful.
That's why I think digital campaigns are really important. Digital campaigns are the way to, I think, kind of tackle a lot of those issues, because you have that beautiful documentary, you have that beautiful film that stands alone and that people have enjoyed as a story, have enjoyed as entertainment. Where's the forum going to be? Okay, let's put it online. Let's create some digital campaigns. Let's create some videos where people can comment. Let's, have it reek through on the comment section. People can fight and bicker and talk about these things. And that's the space, I think, because you're not necessarily detracting from that beautiful piece that you've created, which has entertained millions of people. And I think that's a niche that needs to be filled in many respects. I mean, obviously, there are companies that are investing in doing this, but there is also room for other people. And I think that's kind of where Matt and I decided we wanted to do that. We wanted to create research pieces of students that didn't get their work shouted about. And we wanted to talk about things that were perhaps more hard-hitting than your average piece.
That's great. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, the stuff about plastics was really interesting and kind of neatly leads us on to our final guest of the podcast. We can welcome Fred to the stage.
Hiya.
So we are joined by Frederick Windsor from Water Research Institute at Cardiff University. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely no problem. Thanks very much for having me.
Great. So you work at the Water Research Institute and you kind of look at persistent pollutants, I think is the phrase you use. What is that, and then how does that encapsulate plastics?
Sure, yeah. So talk about persistent pollutants. We're talking about anything that's persistent and a pollutant, obviously. So currently our focus has been on plastics. Obviously everyone knows they're extremely persistent in the environment, but there's a whole range of other different chemicals we look at, from really old banned chemicals like DDT that were historically used and banned 40, 50 years ago, but we still see them in river systems in dangerously high concentrations in organisms, through to things that are used in the industrial processes in clothing, flame retardants, a whole range of different chemicals that are built to be persistent by humans, but unfortunately have had unintended consequences in the environment.
And so what is the sort of plastics pollution stuff you're looking at specifically? So
primarily within the School of Biosciences, so our core focus is...
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. No, please interrupt.
Two alumni here, yeah.
So we're really interested in the interactions between these pollutants and organisms in the environment, and whether that's how they interact with the pollutants or how they're affected by the pollutants. It's everything relating to the interaction of those two components of ecosystems. But with plastics, we've been looking at primarily the ingestion of plastics by a whole range of different organisms. Big up the insects. I'm an entomologist primarily, so we've been looking at how insects in river systems are ingesting plastics and the potential for them to then transport them up through food chains to higher organisms.
Because I guess fish eat the insects and then we eat the fish and then we end up with plastic in us.
Absolutely, yeah. There's been a lot of work done on marine fish that are obviously sort of highly consumed. The thing with fish, obviously, is they eat them and they're present in their stomachs, but we don't tend to eat the stomachs of fish. Obviously, we're not quite sure whether they're making that jump between the stomachs of fish into their tissues. Obviously, that's potentially a massive pathway. But things like oysters, bivalves, you eat the whole thing. So they're definitely a way of transporting the plastics we've used, disposed of, and that subsequently enter the environment, recycling them back through into the human food chain.
And so I'm guessing the kind of size of plastics eaten by fish and insects are on the micro level. But you hear about microplastics in the ocean a lot and microplastics in different organisms. But what's the main difference between a microplastic on a beach and a macroplastic, like a plastic bag? Is it just size, or do they interact in different ways with toxins?
Yeah, absolutely. So, fundamentally, the definition is purely based on the size of the plastic material. But a lot of existing information we have on the negative effects of plastic tend to be in what we call the meso to macro, so from sort of centimetres to metres in size. Obviously, there are pretty dire direct effects of those kind of sizes of plastic on things like whales and dolphins if they eat plastic bags because they perceive them to be a prey item, or they accidentally eat them. It can cause obviously mortality, the death of those organisms. Microplastics, we have a far less idea about what are the kind of negative effects we might see. We know that some other pollutants sort of piggyback a lot on plastics. We talk about them as potential vectors for both pollutants and bacteria and other pathogens. But we really don't know too much about the sort of potential large-scale effects of microplastics in comparison to other stressors like climate change or other pollutants. We really don't know, so it's sort of up in the air at the moment. They could have quite significant drastic consequences. They might not, but they certainly aren't supposed to be in the environment. I suppose that's the sort of key.
That highlights the sort of importance that we've seen throughout this about funding research, because we need to understand it. It's a really urgent issue.
Absolutely, yeah. At least to better frame it within the broader suite of potential negative effects that are present in the natural environment, like we were talking about climate change earlier. Definitely, yeah.
And what about the breakdown? You must be looking at ways of breaking down these persistent pollutants. Does it work?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the major things we think about in terms of the longevity of plastic in the environment is that big things break down to small things. So even if you prevent a lot of the plastic that we're currently using getting into the environment, there's still going to be the breakdown of the existing plastic there into these smaller pieces. You can break down plastic. Some of the recycling processes, industrial recycling processes, break down plastic and then they can reform it. In the environment, when it breaks down, as I say, we don't really properly understand the full effects of microplastics, but certainly the compounds that make up plastic are toxic in their own right. So some of the additives like phthalates, bisphenol A, when you start to break down plastic, they release these additives, and that can be toxic in itself. So there's a sort of whole range of different problems associated with the breakdown of plastic. You can do it quite in a controlled manner and recycle it quite well, but in the environment, it certainly poses another potential pathway of negative effects.
And what about things like if we want to make a difference in our own homes about using less plastic, or everyone can do things like carrying around a tote bag when they go shopping or buying loose vegetables, but is it something that's going to need a huge shift in the way we live in the future, because plastic isn't everything?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me, coming from working purely on ecology, purely on understanding organisms, to moving into this sphere of looking at the interaction between pollutants and organisms. It's a problem that the whole of society has to deal with. So whether that's making individual changes to your own behaviours, so like you say, carrying around a tote bag rather than buying plastic bags, through to actually limiting the amount of plastic packaging that's used by supermarkets. There's a whole range of different sort of instruments through which we can reduce the amount of plastic we use. But I think it's quite a nice one in a sense that there are very straightforward things that you can do to make a difference. So it's not unattainable. There are some straightforward, simple things you can do to start to cut down on your use of plastic, and ultimately it's a case of using plastic more sensibly. It's a brilliant, resilient material, but we're just not using it really appropriately, and we're certainly disposing far too much of it.
I really like that brilliant, resilient.
Yeah, that was good.
Plastic. So she's brilliant and resilient. Because I suppose, you can do stuff yourself, but it actually needs buy-in from large organisations to stop using plastic to wrap lettuces and things. And there's quite interesting talk about fungi being used as plastic, as a film to carry stuff like that.
What, to like package fruit and veg and various items. Yeah,
and then also fungus to break it down as well. But then if we're talking about it, then the what's the word I want? Constituent chemicals.
Nice.
Yeah. Constituent chemicals being more toxic than the effects of plastic itself. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, it is. It is a really tough one, because it's become such an integral part of everything we do. You can't really get away from plastic, whether it's in the carpet on the floor. If you've not got a wool carpet, you've got a synthetic natural carpet, or it's really hard to move away from, and it's become sort of an integral component of our economy, of the global economy. So it is difficult, and also potentially the alternatives aren't particularly palatable either. So we've been looking at, okay, if we're moving away from plastic, what other materials will we replace plastic with? Some of the natural materials, obviously cotton, wool, they're extremely water and energy intensive to produce. So it's a real difficult one to solve, because plastics, although we know potentially they're dangerous in the environment, obviously they're ultimately, most of the current plastics are ultimately made from crude oil. The alternatives also have associated negative effects. So there are positives and negatives, obviously, of every material you use. But it's a really tough question.
Why have we done this to ourselves?
No, but do you know what, the plastics thing I'm absolutely fascinated with, and I think because there are so many different avenues with it, I've got so many questions. We could be here all day, and I promise to kind of limit them. But my first one is the fact you mentioned, a persistent pollutant. The reason why these items and these things like you're talking about plastic being in the carpet to make it more durable because it's longer lasting, and so you're talking about decades and decades and decades of development in these items and chemicals to make them fit the uses that we want. So you're talking years and years, millions and millions and millions of pounds put into this research to make things last longer or be more malleable or, fit for purpose. And what we're trying to do is actually go, hang on, no, guys, we hate plastic now. So can we go back and just kind of redo? And you think about the amount of work that's gone in, and then all of a sudden the tide's changed. Oh no, we need to go back and redo it. So that in itself is massive. But the other thing is, like you mentioned, plastic is such an incredible thing. The fact that we have used it to do various, you think about in hospitals, how much of the equipment is plastic,
or packagings of sterile packaging.
Exactly. All of this kind of stuff is absolutely vital. So it seems that plastic, for whatever reason, has become everyone's like, oh my God, anti-plastic, which, Glastonbury, obviously, in the last day, have announced that they're banning the single-use plastics at the festival, which is awesome. But there are the good uses. So again, we're back to messaging, I think, and communication about, so we want people to make changes using a single water bottle rather than, buying 10 bottles of water. That everyone can get their head around that. But the fact is it's almost getting that message right in terms of, yes, actually, we shouldn't be doing away with plastic as such, because we do need it and it's vital for this, and this. But what we do need to think about is our own sort of household use of it, our personal use of it, and are there alternatives that are coming through that are suitable for us and affordable.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about some of the stuff you've been doing lately is we've talked about it throughout the show about lobbying government almost, and you've been working with the National Assembly for Wales on their plastic inquiry recently. So what did that involve?
Yeah. So that was really exciting, actually. So that's what the first piece of work we did, looking at plastic and invertebrates, got some quite nice media attention. So we were invited to.
I wrote the press release for
that.
that.
There you go.
Oh, I see.
There you go. Yeah, that was exactly
working
why.
It's not the research. It's no, I'm joking.
Yeah, no. So it was really good. So Welsh Government tend to be very proactive in terms of the way they look at the environment. So it's great, and they picked up on the problem of plastic not only in marine systems as we sort of classically know it, but in inland waters. So where we're primarily doing our research. They asked us to come in and give evidence into an inquiry into microplastic pollution in Welsh waterways. So we talked about some of the work we've been doing, similar things to what we've been talking about now. And obviously they're interested in plastic from use right through to its eventual fate, whether that's being recycled or in the environment. So it was really good. It was quite testing. They were asking me things about the potential human health implications of plastics, which I really didn't want to wade in on or say that I was any sort of expert on that. But it was a great opportunity. And again, the Welsh Government being proactive in setting some targets to limit environmental degradation. So it's really good, yeah.
Great. I think that leads on to our last part about our plan nicely. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you. And look, Fred's wearing the badge.
I know, he's wearing a badge as well.
Wearing a badge.
Everyone repping the merch.
Wearing a badge. It's cool. I don't have a badge.
I'll get you a badge.
Do you have a badge?
No, I don't have one.
I know who made the badge.
Oh my God, look at this bag of merch. I want one.
Our lovely, lady sat in the front row. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. What's your name? Jess made the Inside the Petri Dish badges. She loves the badge.
Yeah.
You were telling me earlier that someone asked for a badge of a big blow up of your face, and you did it. Yeah. She is that passionate about badges.
I want
See? Everyone's going to want one now. Who wants a badge of Jessica? Hands up.
Can I have a badge of my face?
Okay. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you so much for doing that. They're wicked.
So we'll move
what are they
on.
made out of? Plastic? Anyway, moving on.
So we'll move on to the last part of our show, and then we'll get out of this sweat box. So Fred's involvement in the National Assembly for Wales's plastic inquiry is really interesting, because a common theme throughout this is clearly we need buy-in from people. I know we're three passionate women, but we need buy-in from people bigger than ourselves. So I think that's a really big, important part of formulating this plan is lobbying government. And some of the ways people could do that is getting out and marching at stuff like the climate change marches.
Well, I think it's something that's actually popped up in all the three areas with our guest today, isn't it? There is a role of politics and government within each of the areas we've discussed. And I think Jon mentioned the fact that the problems are bigger than the life cycles of certain governments and certain political systems. So that's always going to be the problem, because you can take 2 steps forward with one party or group or president, and then you can take 11 steps back. So that's a factor, because what one government will say, yeah, we're really passionate about plastics in Welsh waters. You could fast forward a few years and no, it's about mental health, and there are so many things that we need to look at in the world, and that's my concern is how do we lobby government to make changes that are lasting, not just on a whim.
Yeah, because they do a lot of things with buzzwords to get attention. I think one of the interesting things, I was listening to a talk by Greta, the 16-year-old girl from Sweden, and she said, it feels like the house is on fire and no one cares.
Have you seen that meme of the dog sitting in the house and it's like, everything's on fire, this is fine?
Yeah,
that's what it feels like.
That's what it's like.
This is fine. Everything's on fire. It's fine.
It's like it's just a shame that kids are having to skip school and march because they don't feel like their future is being taken care of, because people who are going to die before it affects them don't care, or they're using buzzwords to get people's attention. Like, moving on to mental health, we need cross-party investment in something like this, and everyone to agree, which might be difficult in some areas of the world where climate change and evolution and things are denied. But you need cross-party investment in saying, this is our biggest issue we're facing, and we cannot continue to keep getting people's attention elsewhere for votes.
It's something that, politics shouldn't even be allowed to get in the way. It's something that countries on a global scale need to work together to achieve, because it's not just something that's going to affect this country now, it's going to affect all of us across the whole planet. So whether that means we have a Star Trek-esque system across the whole planet where we have some kind of, very like the United Nations, but something just made up of all these amazing children.
Yeah,
that would be amazing.
Imagine just children shouting at like a
United
whole
Nation.
Giant United Nation of children just shouting at adults, being like, "Why aren't you doing something?" And this
Why are
is
you being an idiot? That's just what they would say over and over again. But look at the youth group, within the Senate, and they met last week, didn't they, to discuss their agenda for the coming year or 2 years. Correct me if my facts are wrong, because I read it quite quickly, but mental health was one of the big things that came through from them, climate change, environmental issues. And actually, I'm going to be really honest, when we started the podcast, we were like, how do we make this sound at all positive? Because it's basically just going to sound like the world is fucked, however which way we dress this up. But here's a positive, my first one today. The fact that children are doing this is the positive, is the fact that they know about it. And if they know about it, then something is working, whether that is within schools, education, within their parents and their families, passing on that knowledge, or media doing a great job, digital communication. They clearly are getting the message. So, first positive of the day, the fact that these kids are really empowered, that is amazing. So that's the first tick in the box. Woo.
Children are our future, I think someone said once in a song. I can't name the person who said it, but yes, it's just a shame that it's children that are driving the force, but maybe that's an idea to lower the voting age, because clearly old people can't be trusted.
Well, would the Brexit decision have gone differently if we lowered the age to 16?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, absolutely. Most of the remaining votes were from younger people, so absolutely.
So if there was a referendum about climate change and the voting age was 16, what would the outlook be? Would it be, we don't care, or would it be, someone do something about this? So I think that's probably the main takeaway point. Well, one of the main takeaway points is lobbying government. And when the podcast is released, we'll put loads of links down in the description of causes and voluntary and charitable organisations that we can support and back to make sure this happens. And I suppose the next thing is money.
Money was a big one, wasn't it?
We were talking about funding research a lot, but how do you make sure that people know, I think a lot of people don't understand that their tax goes towards funding science research, and how do you make sure people reap the benefits of that? If they're paying towards it, they need to have that information which is coming from that research disseminated to them in an understandable way. And that's why science communication is so important. But how do we present that in a way to people which makes them want to get involved with funding more? How do we, lobby governments and people to fund research on a more wider scale?
And this is the thing, because a lot of politicians are from a political background or from various different backgrounds, and not many of them are STEM educated. They don't have that knowledge, and that's why inquiries are really important, something like Fred got involved with. But when you're saying we need to engage with the public about science, we're also talking about engaging with people at home who could be politicians, and who we saw that with Blue Planet and the plastics. Suddenly enough people in the public cared, they wanted to win their votes, and also they saw it themselves and started caring, so they did something about it. We need something that shows this multi-level issue that is sort of the demise of our planet.
But for me, the money thing, I don't think it is about us, you or I, or anyone
having
in
a
the
quick whip
audience
round.
No, we're not going to be able to get the whip round sorted. But I think Victoria mentioned the fact of the blue chip companies, massive businesses, massive, the top 1%. Those are the people that have got the power to change things. We don't. Have we got massive disposable incomes, with modern life? And this is something that, again, has been a thread through the podcast. Whatever we've spoken about, it's money and it's cost, and we come back to this. Oh well, we need to educate people to make the changes, or to choose an electric car, or to think about their fuel that's coming into their house. Or it all costs money, and for a lot of people in 2019, in this current state, more people are going to food banks, and people are worried, losing sleep over the future. What will Brexit do to house prices? What will, how will education change? Movement within Europe and for future generations. All of this stuff is keeping people awake at night. But so it's almost like we've got enough on our plates. Yeah. And actually the people that could make a difference are the multi-millionaires and these massive companies which are turning over huge profits. And
at the expense of the planet.
And instead of giving these massive, well done pat on the backs to the shareholders, and it's, I think there needs to be a conscious, an environmental conscience of, right, okay, I need to be more conscious about how I spend my money, and if I was to make a donation of $100 million to this, I mean, what would that do? But there are people on this planet that could do that.
Yeah.
They're not us.
It shouldn't be
but there are people.
It shouldn't be on the shoulders of everyday people.
No.
Yeah. So, any other final points before we wrap up our podcast?
I think we've pretty much just established that, science and education, making information accessible, is the way forward to a lot of this. Just trying out new things and investing in research, making sure these things are open to the public. So, we need to make a real effort to make sure science communicators are, given the opportunity to do their job in the best way possible. And just to tell people that, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not, as scary as we think it is. We just need to work together.
Yeah, and I think there's something amazing about thousands of children taking the opportunity to raise their voice about something they care about that is this big issue. And you could say it's a shame that they're having to do that, but you could also say we've got a passionate generation who will change this planet regardless of everyone else. And I think that's probably a good way.
It's amazing.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a good way to end our podcast as well. So thank you so much to all of our guests who have attended and helped us with our plan. Thank you to our audience who have listened along.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
This is a Stimulus Network podcast.